after Jesus' resurrection, of course, there is the spread of the gospel we'll talk about in a little bit. But as we move back into our outline and talk about cultural and societal developments, one of the things that we see within, or one of the things that is minimalized in this first century that will be of utmost importance in later centuries is what's the relationship between this group of followers of Jesus and those outside of him. When we think about what happened there, lost mine. Well, I've just lost my slide. There we go. When we think about things like the relationship between church and state, the relationship between church and the world, there's not much that we see discussed in the New Testament. Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, Revelation chapter 13 and 17. I mean, these are the basic places we can go to talk about, what does the New Testament say about how Christians view their relationship with government. And it doesn't seem to be a major topic. Certainly the Old Testament has a lot to say about government, right? Laying out the laws for government. But now that we're talking about the kingdom of God in the Roman Empire, there's not much discussion. I mean, certainly we can say from Romans 13, obey authority. 1 Peter 2, very similar. On the other hand, when you look at Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 17, you see the Roman Empire as the enemy of the church, the enemy of Christians. Right? And so there's kind of the paradoxical examination in the New Testament, where on the one hand you're to obey authority, but on the other hand recognize that that Satan is going to be using the state to try and wipe Christians out. Much more is said about the relationship between the church and the world. Okay? And thinking about the relationship between how the church, how Christians should be separate from the world, different from the world. But the role of government, again, we don't have much from that. And then finally, when we think about culture and society, there's a lot that's said in the New Testament about how you live as a Christian in society. Right? Living, having quietness of spirit, living a modest life, both physically with your clothing, but also with your attitude and behavior. The notion of living morally. And really, in many respects, as we've already begun to see, living a radical type of lifestyle compared to the Gentile world especially. Any questions or comments? We'll say much more about culture and society as we get into the 2nd century and onward, because then we see much more said about those things. Christianity, of course, started as a movement within Judaism of the 1st century. While Jesus did interact with a few Gentiles, it was relatively few. And when we look at the area that Jesus traveled, it is relatively small. When we look at the place of Judea in the larger Roman Empire, it's even smaller. And so Jesus himself did not extensively travel, extensively interact with the non-Jewish world. And so it's after his death when a lot of the spread of this group began. Of course, in the book of Acts, he lays out a vision for the apostles of where they are to go, how they are to spread this. Right? That is to be Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. But when it comes to what happens after that? We know that Christianity is spreading, but we don't know all the hows and whys. And somebody has said that Acts should actually be called some of the Acts of some of the apostles. Because other than Paul, John, and Peter, James is executed, and that's about it after chapter 1, or chapter 2, really. And there's not much discussion about what the other apostles were doing. There's not much discussion of what the thousands that are being baptized are doing. There's not a discussion of where these people are going. There are legends that some of these apostles made it as far as Spain, maybe as far as India, going the other way. Thomas, for example, there's legends that he went to India, but we don't know. When Saul starts persecuting the church, Luke says that the people of Jerusalem went everywhere preaching the word. And so it extends beyond that. The end of Acts chapter 8, of course, talks about the Ethiopian eunuch and how he goes on his way rejoicing. Does it seem likely that he goes on his way rejoicing to get back to Ethiopia and then doesn't tell anybody? All right? And so there's people going all over the place, thousands of people sharing the message. They went everywhere preaching the word. So much so that Paul will make the claim in Galatians chapter 1, verse 23, that the gospel was preached to the whole world. Now, certainly, Paul is probably hyperbolizing here, because there's no indication, for example, that anybody has made it to the Americas, right, or to Australia or any place like that. But essentially, the idea that Paul is probably talking about is using the whole world there to refer to the Roman Empire, and talking about the extent of it, not to suggest that every person in the entire Roman Empire even has heard the message of Christ, but to suggest that everybody's going everywhere talking about the gospel, and it's just going to continue to expand. And so in a sense, they have completed the missions that Jesus sent. They've gone to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. But, that's still, in just a few decades, a sizable spread. We turn now to talk about some doctrines of Christianity. And again, there's certainly some things we'll talk about. We'll emphasize some key doctrines, but it's important to realize that throughout the first century, a lot of doctrine was, in a sense, developing. And I say that from the human standpoint, because some of the things that we hold as true doctrines are only revealed to people as things have come up. Right? And so when we think about, for example, the issue of grace and works, it's only really when Paul writes Romans that starts to get clarified for people. And so it's gradually developing. And it's not, I don't mean to suggest that there's not a truth, but the idea of the epistles were to deal with occasional situations, right? Something that developed in the Church of Corinth, and so Paul's writing to them. And so there isn't a full-fledged encyclopedia of doctrine given by Jesus to the apostles. Right? There's the inspiration that takes place. There's the expansion, the spreading of that message. There's also differing forms of Christianity. Christianity might not even be the best term, because it doesn't seem like Christian is used too frequently. In the New Testament, it's only used 3 times. 2 in the book of Acts and once in 1 Peter. To suggest that there are different forms of Christianity in existence is not to suggest, as some scholars would, that there was no orthodox true doctrine. Because some scholars would like to suggest that it was all sorts of differences, and gradually one group came into power and then forced everybody to accept their version. It does not appear to be the case. Because Paul, in his letters, for example, appeals to kind of a common standard about the teaching of Christ. Right? And so he has in his mind, evidently, that there is a way to do things. there is truth, and there is what we might call the orthodox teaching of Christ. There is the gospel, and there's false teaching. But we can certainly see that there are differing forms of Christianity. Some of it is minor. Those Jews that became followers of Jesus, for example, some of them wanted to hold on to their Jewish traditions. Sometimes people refer to it as their scruples about what meats you can eat, what meats you can't eat, observing the Sabbath, other things like that. Right? So there were some Jews that wanted to keep some of those traditions. Perfectly all right. That would be represented by, let's say, James, the brother of Jesus. Right? He seems to be one of those that really has a Jewish sensibility of the gospel about him. Paul, on the other hand, has a more universal mindset. Right? And so he recognizes that meats have been cleansed by Jesus, so you can eat whatever you want. Observance of days is an important thing in the sense of the Jewish Sabbath and Passover and those kinds of things. Right? So he has a more universalizing view, but he will allow for the weaknesses of his brothers and sisters who don't have that full understanding. Right? So there's differences, but that's not a problem. What the problem is, though, is you have those Judaizers who are trying to make the Gentiles become followers of the law of Moses in order to be saved. Right? So you have to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses in order to be a follower of Jesus. That's where, of course, Paul draws the line. That's not true. So there are some forms of Christianity that are different in customs. That's okay. There are some forms that are moving away from the gospel. Those that claim that the resurrection had already taken place. And Paul condemns that. There's cases in John's writing that indicate some people didn't believe Jesus actually came in human form, actually came in flesh. Right? So we see a variety in Christianity, but that doesn't mean there wasn't an orthodoxy. Another important part of Christian doctrine, of course, that's developing is the laying out of what Jesus had done, the gradual construction of the Gospels in the sense of they're orally transmitted and then written down. Other things, laying out how the church is to worship, what's to be done, how it's to be done, all of those kind of things are occurring in the first century. With respect to all that, there are a couple of doctrines that I would say are key doctrines in that first century period that are maybe a little bit more important than some other doctrines. I don't want to push that too far. But there seem to be some key doctrines that a lot of other things are related to. And at the top, of course, is the issue of resurrection. That is the key doctrine. And it shapes so much of the Christian message. When you think about, for example, how Paul talks about baptism, he centers it in the resurrection. Right? Just as Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, so too we are to die to sin, be buried in baptism, and rise to walk in new life, in Romans chapter 6. Right? So this idea of resurrection and baptism, communion. While a lot of people will emphasize the part of communion that talks about Jesus' death, right? The bread, his body, the cup, his blood, we worship it, we celebrate it on the first day of the week, not on a Thursday night or Friday or anything like that. It's the first day of the week. Well, why the first day of the week? The resurrection. The whole fact of not worshiping on the Sabbath, but worshiping on the first day of the week, connected with resurrection, and even the identity of Jesus. And Paul said he was declared to be the Son of God through his resurrection in Romans chapter 1 and verse 4. And so all of this demonstrates that the resurrection is a central doctrine. And a lot of other doctrines and teachings and practices are connected with that. Also very important is the idea that Jesus would be returning. And so the second coming was not only the promise of existing in heaven with God, but the idea of how do you live the right, or why you should live the right kind of life. Why? Because he's coming back, right? And there will be a judgment at the second coming. Right? And so living lives looking forward to that return. Also important is the doctrine of grace. Right? That God extends his favor to human beings. That it is undeserved. Right? There's nothing that human beings have done to deserve the grace that God extends to us. But he has extended his grace to us through Christ. And then faith, of course, being the tunnel, the conduit, so to speak, by which grace comes to us. We're saved by grace through faith. Certainly there are other doctrines that are important, and so that's why I hesitate to say key doctrines. But I think that when we look at it, a lot of the other teachings of the Gospels, a lot of the other teachings of the epistles are connected with these doctrines. Right? And so salvation is connected with the resurrection, is connected with grace. It's important that we trust God, not just act in the right kind of ways. But we should act in the right kind of ways because Jesus is coming back. Right? So they're all kind of connected together. But I think these are the ones that are really different, so to speak, than what Judaism was before. Right? Because under Judaism, there was a notion of grace to some extent, but it emphasized good works. Are good works a part of the Christian life? Yes. But why or how? Well, they're different because of grace and faith, and understood differently because of the resurrection. Let's talk about, in the last couple minutes, some of the practices in early Christianity. Many of the Jews who identified with Jesus as the Messiah, who connected themselves with the followers of Jesus after the death and resurrection of Jesus, were eventually expelled from the synagogues. While Paul and some of the others have success going to synagogues, in some of those early years and early decades, eventually the Jews continued to just expel anyone that claims that Jesus is the Messiah. And so Jewish Christians began to worship in houses or some public places where they could meet together. Most of this means that there doesn't appear to have been any church buildings, so to speak, but instead places were used for worship. But it wasn't necessarily purchased or created for worship. So you worship in a house, or you worship in the temple, for example, or the area of the temple, as we see in Acts. Also connected with this idea of the connection between Christianity and Judaism is what do you do about the law of Moses? That seems to be an important question of practice throughout the first century. And so much of the New Testament addresses this issue of what of the law of Moses needs to be kept. With the division, of course, over circumcision, both Paul and James, however, are involved in vows. Right? Paul shaves his hair, connected with a vow. They are connected with people who observe vows. So some aspects of the law of Moses are problematic, but certainly sacrifices for sin, that's no longer something that you want to do. We talked about the issue of food and holidays and the question of the Sabbath. Very important practice in early Christianity is that of the communion, sometimes referred to as the Lord's Supper, but also, especially toward the end of the first century and beginning of the second century, you see this word Eucharist attached to this practice, coming from the Greek word for giving thanks. And so he took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it, right, and said, and this is my body. So this Eucharist is the term that gets used for this memorial meal connected with the death and resurrection of Jesus. Often the centerpiece of worshiping God and Jesus on the first day of the week We talked about how the resurrection, of course, shaped that. Again, a lot of this, of course, is probably very familiar, but it's important to kind of remember this as background. A lot of Christians, of course, shared the message. Preaching was an important part of practice in that first century. Baptism, a very important practice, as we see throughout the New Testament. You do have, of course, music taking an important role, especially in services. It had been prominent in the synagogues, and so that's kind of a similarity as we move towards these house churches, so to speak. Often, a lot of the music came from the Psalms, so the Psalms provide the words. Some might have been or reinterpreted in light of Jesus. There was also the creation of new hymns that were specifically for Jesus, some of which may be in our New Testament. Some people suggest that there's an indication in Philippians, for example, or 1 Timothy, presence of pieces of early Christian hymns. Fasting also seems to have been a carryover from Judaism. Many Christians engaged in fasting. It does appear that fasting was encouraged to take place on Wednesdays and Fridays, where I believe it's Tuesdays and Thursdays were more the Jewish days of fasting. And so some people engaged in fasting on a regular basis. Questions, comments, anything we need to clarify? All right, if not, we'll pick up on Thursday with the 2nd century and now get into some deeper discussion deeper examination of